Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are stripping away the abstraction. We often talk about the mind as if it's this, ethereal cloud.
Right, a collection of thoughts, feelings, and memories that just sort of floats above the biology.
Exactly. But today, we are going to ground it. We're asking a really fundamental question. What are you actually made of?
And just to be clear, we don't mean water and carbon and calcium.
No, I mean you. Your memory of your first day of school, your ability to speak, that skill you have for parallel parking, your fear of spiders. We tend to think of these as, like, software running on the hardware of the brain.
It's a very common metaphor, but the reality is much more, well, intense.
It is. The central tension we need to resolve today is this difference between accumulation and reorganization.
We have this idea of the brain as maybe a filing cabinet or a hard drive. You learn a fact. Let's say the capital of North Dakota is Bismarck, and you imagine your brain, writing that down on a little slip of paper and tucking it into a folder.
It's a very clean image. Very neat. It implies that learning is just adding inventory to a warehouse.
But physiology, and specifically the physiology we find in our core texts, Ganong and Guyton, tells us that is completely fundamentally wrong. Learning isn't depositing something new into a static container.
Learning is the physical reconstruction of the container itself.
That's it. That is the headline for today. Experience becomes biology. When you learn something, you are physically altering the microscopic structure of your nervous system. You are changing the weights of synapses. You're literally growing new protein structures. You are reshaping the actual flesh and blood of your brain.
Which means, and this is kind of a wild thought, the you, listening to this deep dive right now, is physically different from the you that started it 30 seconds ago.
It's both terrifying and exhilarating, isn't it?
It really is. So here's our roadmap. We are exploring the physiology of learning, memory, language, and speech. We're going to try and trace a thought from a fleeting electrical spark all the way to a permanent structural change in a neuron.
And we're going to figure out why we forget most things and why that's actually a feature, not a bug.
Right. And finally, we'll map out the production of human speech, which you could argue is the single most complex motor task a human being performs.
And as always, we are synthesizing this from the absolute gold standards. We've got Ganong's review of medical physiology on one hand and Guyton and Hall's textbook of medical physiology on the other.
And I really think for this topic, you absolutely need both. They play off each other so well here.
It's a necessary combination. Ganong gives us the cellular reality, the ion channels, the molecular cascades, the real nuts and bolts of what's happening at the synapse.
And then Guyton steps back. He gives us the systems level architecture, the why behind the wiring, and how these individual circuits integrate to create, well, behavior.
Exactly.
So let's start at the very bottom. If learning is a physical process, we have to look at the brick and mortar. We have to look at the cell. And the word that just dominates this entire discussion is plasticity.
Plasticity. It's a word that in, everyday language, plastic usually implies something cheap or artificial.
Or fake.
Right. But in physiology, it means malleable, capable of being shaped and, crucially, holding that shape. Specifically, we're talking about synaptic plasticity.
This is the core idea that the connection, the synapse between two neurons isn't fixed. It's not like a soldered wire in a computer.
Precisely. It's a dynamic relationship. Synaptic plasticity is the ability of neural tissue to change its function based on its history of use. It is the literal physiological mechanism behind that old phrase, use it or lose it.
Which we hear all the time, right? Usually when you're talking about learning a language or, going to the gym.
But in the brain, it is a literal rule of survival for a neuron and its connections. You have to remember, the brain is ridiculously expensive from a metabolic standpoint.
It consumes a huge amount of energy.
A disproportionate amount. So it simply cannot afford to maintain expensive infrastructure.
Right.
We're talking synapses, axon terminals, dendritic spines. If they aren't being used, it's just not efficient.
So if a pathway fires repeatedly, the brain invests in it. It strengthens it, builds it up.
And if it sits silent for too long, the brain dismantles it, reclaims the parts.
There's ruthless efficiency.
It absolutely has to be. And to understand the mechanism of this, how the brain actually decides what to keep and what to cut, Guyton introduces us to a very, very humble teacher.
The snail.
Aplysia, the humble sea snail.
I always find this so grounding. Here we are about to discuss the pinnacle of human consciousness, language, and thought, and we have to start with a mollusk.
We do, because Aplysia has a very simple nervous system with these giant easily accessible neurons. They're perfect for study. And yet the fundamental chemistry it uses to learn is the same as the chemistry in your brain.
And it teaches us the two most basic forms of learning, habituation and sensitization.
The yin and yang of memory.
Let's break these down because I think this is the foundation for everything that comes after. Let's start with habituation.
Habituation is, in essence, negative memory. It is the brain actively learning to ignore something.
Give me a real-world example.
The easiest one is the hum of your refrigerator or the air conditioner, or the feeling of a wristwatch on your wrist.
Ooh, it's a good one.
When you first put the watch on in the morning, you feel it. You feel the cold metal, the weight, the pressure from the band. You are hyper aware of it. 10 minutes later,
It's gone. You don't feel it at all.
right, until I just made you think about it. But why did it disappear? The sensory neurons in your skin are still firing. The pressure is still physically there. The signal is being sent.
But the brain has decided it's meaningless noise. It's not new. It's not a threat. So it gets filtered out.
It gets filtered out. And the question is how? What is happening at the synapse to make that signal just fade away?
So what's the mechanism?
In the snail model, when you stimulate a sensory terminal repeatedly without any consequence, so no pain, no reward, just the same touch over and over, the terminal physically changes. It begins the progressive closure of its calcium channels.
Okay, let's pause here. Quick Physiology 101 refresher. Why is calcium the VIP here? Why does it matter so much?
Calcium is the trigger. It's the key that turns the lock for neurotransmitter release. So an electrical signal, an action potential, travels down the nerve, and when it reaches the end, the presynaptic terminal, that voltage change opens voltage-gated calcium channels.
And calcium rushes into the cell.
It floods in. And that rush of calcium is the signal that tells the little vesicles, the little packets filled with neurotransmitters, to move to the cell wall, fuse with it, and dump their chemical payload into the synapse.
So to put it simply, no calcium, no chemical release.
Yeah.
No chemical release, no message gets sent to the next neuron in the chain.
That's the logic. So in habituation, the cell gradually shuts the door on calcium. Even though the electrical signal arrives at the terminal, the calcium can't get in, or at least not nearly as much gets in.
And the amount of neurotransmitter release just plummets.
It withers on the vine. The signal fades before it's even passed on.
That is fascinating. It's not a passive process of forgetting. It's an active process of shutting down a connection. And why is this so important?
It comes back to energy conservation and focus. If you couldn't habituate, you would be utterly overwhelmed by the constant sensation of your clothes on your skin, the ambient noise in the room, the visual clutter in your peripheral vision. You'd be paralyzed by information overload.
So habituation is the filter that allows you to function in a complex world.
It's the brain's unsubscribe button for irrelevant data streams.
Okay, so that's ignoring the boring stuff. What about the important stuff? How do we form a positive memory?
That is sensitization. This is what happens when a signal is paired with something significant, something the brain deems important. And usually that means something noxious, like pain.
The snail gets a little shock.
Right. In the classic experiment, they pair the gentle touch stimulus with a mild electric shock or a hard tap. The snail's nervous system immediately goes to high alert.
It basically says, okay, that sensation I was starting to ignore, it might be a threat. I need to pay attention to it.
Exactly. And the chemistry just flips completely on its head. Instead of closing channels, the facilitating interneuron releases serotonin onto the sensory terminal.
Serotonin, the famous mood neurotransmitter.
Here, it's acting as a modulator. The serotonin binds to receptors on the sensory neuron and triggers a cascade inside the cell involving a second messenger called CAMP-MP.
Cyclic AMP.
Yes, and this CAMP does something very, very specific and very clever. It blocks potassium channels in the presynaptic terminal.
Okay, we're swapping ions here. We were focused on calcium, now it's potassium. Why does blocking potassium matter?
Well, think about the shape of an action potential, that electrical spark. Sodium rushes in to start it, to depolarize the cell, and then potassium rushes out to stop it, to repolarize and reset the cell.
So potassium is a reset button. It's the brakes.
It's the brakes. So if you block the potassium channels, you delay the reset, you're essentially cutting the brake lines. The action potential lasts much, much longer.
And if the electrical spark, the depolarization, lasts longer,
then the voltage-gated calcium channels stay open longer.
which means more calcium rushes into the cell.
A massive influx of calcium.
And that massive influx of calcium means a massive release of neurotransmitter.
A huge release. So purely through this chemical cascade, the pain signal has supercharged the connection. It's turned the volume knob from a 3 all the way up to an 11.
That's sensitization, the
Yep.
emotional or survival context. The pain chemically stamps the memory as important. It facilitates the pathway.
That's it, exactly.
And this explains so much. It explains why I can't for the life of me remember where I put my keys 5 minutes ago, a neutral event. But I can vividly remember touching a hot stove when I was 5 years old.
Because the stove came with a massive chemical stamp. The pain triggered that serotonin dump. Your keys, unfortunately, did not.
Okay, so that's the snail level.
Hmm.
It explains reflexes, basic learning. But human memory is so much richer than that. We remember context, we remember faces, we remember abstract concepts. How do we get from a snail flinching from a shock to a physicist understanding EMC2?
Ah, well, for that, you need a much more robust and permanent mechanism. That requires something called long-term potentiation, or LTP. This is the heavy lifting of memory.
And this is where Ganon's text really shines, right? In the detailed breakdown, particularly in the hippocampus.
Yes. The hippocampus, that seahorse-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe that we always associate with memory formation.
Right.
And inside the hippocampus, there's a well-studied pathway, the Schaefer collaterals, where we can watch LTT happen in a dish. And it all relies on a very special, very clever receptor, the NMDA receptor.
I love the mechanics of this receptor. It's not just a simple on-off switch. It acts like a logic gate.
It does. It's what we call a coincidence detector.
Yeah.
It's designed to only open when two things happen at once. Here's the setup. You have glutamate, which is the brain's main excitatory neurotransmitter.
The go signal.
The go signal. It's floating around in the synapse. It wants to bind to the NMDA receptor on the postsynaptic neuron and open it.
But there's a problem. A big one.
A very big problem. There is a magnesium ion sitting right inside the channel, physically blocking it. It's like a bouncer standing in the doorway of a club with his arms crossed.
Sorry, you're not on the list. You can't come in.
Exactly. So if a weak signal comes in, just a little bit of glutamate from a single casual firing, it knocks on the door, but the magnesium bouncer doesn't budge. Nothing happens.
And this is why we don't form long-term memories of every casual glance or every background noise we hear. The signal just isn't strong enough to get past the bouncer.
Correct. So the question becomes, how do we get the bouncer to move?
What does it take?
It takes what's called tetanic stimulation. Rapid, repeated, intense firing. If the postsynaptic cell gets excited enough by other nearby receptors, specifically AMPA receptors, if it depolarizes significantly, the inside of the cell becomes strongly positive.
And the magnesium ion is also positively charged.
Right, so the strong positive charge inside the cell physically repels the positive magnesium ion. It's simple electrostatic repulsion.
Like trying to push the same poles of two magnets together, it just pops out.
Precisely. The voltage change kicks the bouncer out of the doorway.
And once the bouncer's gone,
The floodgates open, the channel is now clear, glutamate is bound, and calcium rushes into the cell. But in LTP, this calcium does so much more than just release neurotransmitters.
it's a second messenger.
It acts as a powerful second messenger. It travels deep into the cell, even into the nucleus. It activates protein kinases, enzymes like CAM-KI. It flips the switch on genes. It triggers protein synthesis.
This is the reconstruction part we talked about at the beginning.
This is it. The neuron literally starts building. It builds more AMPA receptors and inserts them into the membrane, so the cell is more sensitive to glutamate next time. It triggers the release of retrograde messengers that go back and tell the presynaptic neuron to release more glutamate in the future.
So it's strengthening both sides of the conversation.
Both sides. And it physically grows the synapse. It changes the shape and size of the dendritic spines, making the connection more robust and permanent.
This is the aha moment for me. This explains why cramming for an exam the night before often fails. But spaced repetition, studying something intensely over several days, actually works.
Because you need that repeated, intense firing to reliably kick out the magnesium and trigger the construction crew. You're not just reviewing information, you're building neural infrastructure.
It's like paving a road. If one car drives over a dirt path, nothing much changes.
A single thought.
Right. But if a convoy of heavy trucks drives over it again and again, that's the repeated firing, the city eventually decides to pave it. They pour concrete, they build a highway. And now, information can travel down that path effortlessly.
That is long-term potentiation.
And once that highway is built, you don't need the same intense effort anymore. the memory is now structural. It's embedded in the hardware.
Exactly. And this brings us up a level from the synapse to the system. Because we aren't just a big, undifferentiated bag of synapses, we are a structured architecture.
We have to talk about the different types of memory because, remembering a fact feels completely different from remembering how to do a skill.
It feels different because it is different physiologically.
Hmm.
This is the classic distinction between explicit and implicit memory, or, as they're sometimes called, declarative and non-declarative memory.
Explicit is the what?
Right. The stuff you can declare. Facts, events, people, places. The capital of France is Paris. I had oatmeal for breakfast this morning. That's my cousin Sarah. This is explicit or declarative memory. And crucially, this type of memory requires the hippocampus to be formed.
And implicit memory is the how.
The how. Skills, habits, conditioned reflexes, how to ride a bike, how to serve a tennis ball, how to type on a keyboard. You don't declare how to ride a bike. In fact, if you try to consciously explain the physics of it while you're doing it, you'll probably fall off.
It's intuitive.
Yeah.
It's what people call muscle memory.
Right. And physiologically, it uses a completely different set of brain circuits. It involves areas like the striatum, the cerebellum for motor skills, and the amygdala for emotional responses. And most importantly, it does not require the hippocampus.
And the most famous, most profound proof of this distinction, really this case study that taught us almost everything we know about this, is the patient HM.
Henry Molaison. It is a tragic but scientifically invaluable story. In the 1950s, Henry suffered from severe, life-threatening epilepsy that they couldn't control with drugs.
And they traced the seizures to his temporal lobes.
Yes. So in a desperate attempt to stop the seizures, surgeons performed a bilateral medial temporal lobectomy. They removed the hippocampus and parts of the surrounding amygdala on both sides of his brain.
And the result was startling.
The seizures did stop, which was the goal. But Henry was left with a profound, dense anterograde amnesia. He completely lost the ability to form new explicit memories.
He lived in a permanent...
A window of about 30 seconds to maybe a couple of minutes. You could walk into his room, introduce yourself, have a lovely chat for 10 minutes, leave the room, come back 5 minutes later, and he would have absolutely no idea who you were. He would greet you as a stranger.
He couldn't learn new names, new dates, new events, nothing that happened after the surgery stopped.
Nothing. But, and this is the absolute kicker, he could learn new skills.
He could form new implicit memories.
Yes. The researchers, particularly Brenda Milner, gave him a task called mirror drawing. You have to trace the outline of a star, but you can only see your hand and the star in a mirror.
Which is very tricky because your hand movements are reversed.
It's very difficult at first. And on the first day, he was terrible at it, just like anyone would be. The second day he came in, looked at the apparatus, and said, "I've never done this before in my life." He had zero conscious memory of the previous day's practice.
But when he picked up the pen...
His hand knew what to do. He was better. He made fewer errors. By the third day, he was nearly perfect at it. His motor system, his implicit memory circuit, was learning and improving day by day.
Even though his conscious, explicit mind had no record of it whatsoever.
None. This single case study was the definitive proof that these two memory systems are anatomically separate.
And it also proves that the hippocampus isn't the final warehouse of memory. It's more like the manufacturing plant.
That is a perfect analogy. The hippocampus is the factory. It takes in the raw materials of sensory experience and processes them, organizes them, encodes them into a stable memory. But once those memories are fully formed and consolidated,
They get shipped out.
they're shipped out to the neocortex for long-term storage. Visual memories get stored in the visual cortex, auditory memories in the auditory cortex, and so on. They're distributed across the brain.
So HM lost the manufacturing plant. He could keep all the old inventory. His childhood memories were largely intact because they had already been manufactured and shipped out before his surgery.
But he couldn't make anything new. The factory was closed.
Right, and this touches on this key concept of consolidation. Memory takes time to set, like concrete.
Yes. It's not instantaneous. Guyton mentions a specific time frame for this.
What does he say?
He says that short-term memory, which is thought to be just electrical reverberation circuits of neurons firing in a self-sustaining loop, lasts for seconds to minutes. To become a stable, long-term memory, you need that chemical and structural change of LTP we talked about.
The construction
It's a
project.
construction project. And Guyton notes it takes about 5 to 10 minutes for even a minimal hold and an hour or more for a really strong permanent hold.
And this is why concussions cause that very specific type of memory loss.
Retrograde amnesia for recent events.
Yeah.
Exactly. If a boxer gets knocked out, he often has no memory of the punch or the few minutes leading up to it. He'll ask, what happened?
He remembers walking into the ring, he remembers the early rounds,
Yeah.
but the final moments are just gone.
Because the punch, the trauma, disrupted the electrical activity in his brain before the concrete could set. The manufacturing plant was shut down mid-shift, and the products on the assembly line were just lost forever.
So we've covered how we store things, but I want to shift gears and talk about why we store things. I mean, we are just bombarded with data every single second. The color of the wall, the hum of the AC, the smell of coffee, the face of a person walking by. How on earth does the brain decide, okay, this conversation is worth keeping, but the pattern on the rug is trash?
Now we have to enter the limbic system, the so-called emotional brain. The limbic system is the arbiter of relevance. It's the system that tags experiences as important or unimportant.
And Guyton, in his typical fashion, breaks this down into very primitive, fundamental terms: reward and punishment.
It's very binary at its core. Deep in the brain, in the hypothalamus and surrounding areas, we have specific clusters of neurons that act as centers for these feelings. If you put an electrode into the reward center of a rat or a human and stimulate it, they report intense feelings of placidity, pleasure, and tranquility.
And if you stimulate the punishment center,
You get the opposite: terror, pain, rage, fear. It's profoundly unpleasant.
and the rule for learning then becomes incredibly simple.
It does. If a sensory experience comes in and it triggers neither the reward nor the punishment centers, the brain habituates to it. It says, this is irrelevant to my survival or well-being. Discard it.
But if it has a positive or negative emotional tag,
If it triggers reward or punishment, the brain says, reinforce this pathway. This is important. I need to remember this so I can either seek it out again or avoid it in the future.
Guyton has this great line, something like, learning is the retention of signals that facilitate survival.
It's a very utilitarian, very functional view of the mind. We don't remember things for the sake of remembering. We remember what helps us survive and thrive.
And within the limbic system, the amygdala is the great gatekeeper here. Guyton calls it the window through which the system sees the world.
That's a great description. The amygdala's job is to connect sensory input to its proper emotional context. It looks at the visual signal of a coiled shape on the path and connects it to the feeling of fear and the label snake.
And we know how absolutely vital this is because of what happens when it's gone. We have to talk about Clever-Bussy syndrome.
This is a classic, if pretty disturbing, piece of neuroscience history. Researchers removed the amygdala bilaterally in monkeys, and their behavior changed in these radical, specific ways.
What happened?
First, they became fearless. They would approach things that would normally terrify a monkey, like snakes, without any hesitation. They'd even try to play with them.
But it's not true bravery, is it? It's a lack of understanding.
Exactly. The researchers called it psychic blindness. The monkey's eyes work fine. It sees the snake. But it doesn't understand the meaning of the snake. The emotional tag is gone. They also developed extreme curiosity, specifically oral curiosity. They would put everything in their mouths: rocks, feces, nails. They were constantly trying to verify what things were because that immediate visual emotional connection was broken.
And the text also mentions hypersexuality.
Yes, they would lose all social and biological context for sexual behavior. They'd attempt to mate with other species, with inanimate objects. The filters were just gone.
It really shows that so much of what we consider civilized or normal behavior is actually just the amygdala applying these constant unconscious filters.
It's the amygdala whispering, that is dangerous. That is socially inappropriate. That is not food. Without it, we are just sensory processing machines with absolutely no judgment.
And the physical expression of all this emotion, the rage, the fear, often gets funneled through the hypothalamus.
Right. We usually think of the hypothalamus as the body's thermostat controlling temperature, hunger, thirst, but it's also the motor output for raw emotion.
The rage patterns.
Exactly. If you stimulate the punishment centers in the hypothalamus of a cat, it doesn't just sit there feeling bad internally, it hisses. Its claws extend, its pupils dilate, its hair stands on end.
It initiates the entire coordinated physiological program of rage.
It shows that emotion isn't just a feeling in the ether. It is a full-body physiological response driven and coordinated by these deep, ancient structures.
Okay, let's climb out of the basement of the brain. We've been in the primitive emotional centers. Let's go up to the penthouse, the cortex, the supposed seat of thinking.
The neocortex, and specifically for this conversation, the prefrontal association area. This is the part of the brain right behind your forehead. It's the part that expanded most dramatically in human evolution.
We used to have this, very simple idea that this was the intelligence center. The bigger your forehead, the smarter you were.
That was the old phrenological view. But the tragic and frankly barbaric era of prefrontal lobotomies in the mid-20th century taught us something very different and much more nuanced.
This is where surgeons would sever the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain to treat severe mental illness.
Yes. And from a physiological standpoint, the results were puzzling at first. The patients didn't lose their long-term memory. They didn't lose their ability to speak or understand language. They could still do math problems. Their scores on standard IQ tests often didn't change very much.
So what did they lose?
In a sense, they lost the future.
That is a very poetic way to put it.
They lost the ability to plan. They lost ambition. They lost the ability to string sequential thoughts together in a coherent line to reach a distinct goal. They couldn't hold a complex plan in their mind.
So they lived entirely in the impulse of the moment, no long-term consequences.
Exactly. The prefrontal cortex is the home of what we call working memory. It's the brain's mental scratch pad. It's where you hold multiple bits of information. I need to buy milk, then pick up the kids from school, but first I have to stop for gas, and organize them into a coherent plan of action.
So without it, you're just incredibly distractible. You can't maintain a single train of thought long enough to solve a complex, multi-step problem.
Precisely. It tells us that true intelligence isn't just raw processing speed or a big vocabulary. It's the ability to stay on track. It's executive function.
It's the conductor of the orchestra.
Yeah.
The individual musicians, the other brain areas, can still play their instruments, but without the conductor, there's no symphony. It's just noise.
That's a perfect analogy.
And Guyton brings up a holistic theory of thought here that I found really compelling. We often get stuck wanting to find the one specific neuron for a concept, the so-called grandmother neuron, that fires only when you see your grandma.
But the physiology suggests that a thought is a much more global event. It's not localized to one spot. It's a simultaneous pattern of stimulation involving the cortex, the thalamus, the limbic system, and the reticular formation, all firing in a specific coordinated pattern at the same time.
So a thought isn't a place in the brain, it's a state of the brain.
That's it. The visual cortex adds the image of your grandmother's face. The limbic system adds the feeling of warmth and love. The temporal lobe adds her name. The thought of your grandmother is the integration of all of those parts at once.
And the ultimate expression of this kind of integration has to be language. This is arguably the human superpower.
Language is fascinating from a physiological perspective because it is so heavily lateralized. We have two brain hemispheres that look almost identical, but for most people, they do very, very different things.
The categorical and the representational hemispheres.
Yes, in about 95% of right-handed people and about 70% of left-handers, the left hemisphere is the categorical hemisphere. It handles the sequential analytic processes, language, grammar, logic, math.
And the right hemisphere.
The right hemisphere is the representational hemisphere. It handles spatiotemporal relations, recognizing faces, appreciating music, and crucially, it handles the context of speech, the tone of voice, the emotional inflection, the body language.
So to put it simply, the left brain reads the text and the right brain reads the subtext.
That is a brilliant way to put it. Absolutely. And we see this split most dramatically in so-called split brain patients. These are individuals who have had their corpus callosum, the massive bridge of nerve fibers connecting the two sides, cut to stop the spread of epileptic seizures.
And Guyton tells this story about a teenage boy with a split brain that completely blew my mind. It's an incredible demonstration.
It's a classic experiment by Michael Gazzaniga. They flash the word kiss very briefly to the boy's left visual field. Now, because of the way the optic nerves cross, everything in your left visual field goes to your right hemisphere.
The non-speaking, romantic, intuitive side of the brain.
Exactly. So the right brain sees the word kiss. It understands the concept. It can't speak, but it can control the body's emotional response. So what does the boy do? He immediately smiles, blushes a little, and acts all cheeky and embarrassed.
His body reacts to the word, but then the researcher asks him, "What did you see?"
Now, that question goes to his left hemisphere, the speaking brain, but the left brain is completely blind to what the right brain saw. There's no bridge for the information to cross. So the boy, speaking from his left brain, says, I didn't see anything.
But he's sitting there blushing and smiling. It's a total contradiction.
So the researcher pushes him, well, why are you smiling then? And this is the amazing part. The left brain, which some neuroscientists call the interpreter, has to make sense of the body's behavior. It can't access the real reason, so it just makes something up.
It confabulates.
It confabulates. The boy says something like, oh, no, this machine is funny. The left brain invented a plausible reality to explain the body's emotional state. It shows that we essentially have two consciousnesses in one skull, usually working in harmony but capable of operating completely independently.
That is just wild.
Yeah.
But okay, let's look at how a unified brain actually produces speech. Because it's not just one spot that does language, it's a whole roadmap, a circuit.
It is. It's primarily the Wernicke-Broca loop. So let's trace a simple conversation. I ask you a question, how are you today?
Okay, step one, I have to hear it.
The sound waves hit your ear. The signal goes to the primary auditory cortex in your temporal lobe, but that just registers it as sound. The signal is then immediately sent to Wernicke's area, which is right nearby in the posterior superior temporal gyrus.
And Wernicke's is the general interpretative area. This is where meaning happens.
This is the seat of comprehension. Wernicke's is where all the sensory association areas feed in. It takes those raw sounds, how are you today, and extracts the abstract meaning. It understands the concept of the question.
Okay, so my brain gets it. You're asking about my well-being. Now I need to formulate a reply. I am fine.
Wernicke's area formulates that thought. It then sends that conceptual plan along a massive bundle of nerve fibers called the arcuate fasciculus. Think of it as a superhighway connecting the back of the brain to the front.
And the destination of that highway is Broca's area.
Broca's area, in the frontal lobe. Broca's is the motor planner for speech. It doesn't care about the philosophy or meaning of the sentence. It cares about the mechanics. It creates the detailed sequential motor program, the precise movements for the lips, tongue, larynx, and the coordination of breath. To physically articulate the sounds, I am fine.
And then it just hands that finished motor plan off to the adjacent motor cortex to actually execute it, to send the signals to the muscles.
That's the loop, from sound to meaning to motor plan to action.
And we understand this loop so well because of what happens when parts of it break, the aphasias.
Right. If a person has a stroke that damages Wernicke's area, you get Wernicke's aphasia or fluent aphasia. The patient can speak perfectly smoothly, the rhythm is right, the intonation is normal, but the words are complete garbage.
The flim-flam is on the whiz-bang because of the gribbet.
Exactly. It's a word salad. They use neologisms, made-up words, or real words in nonsensical orders. And because their comprehension center is broken, they're often completely unaware that they aren't making sense. They think they're communicating perfectly.
Which is so different from Broca's aphasia.
Completely different. If the damage is to Broca's area, you get non-fluent aphasia. Here, Wernicke's is intact. They can understand everything you say to them perfectly. They know exactly what they want to say in their own mind, but the motor planner is broken.
They have the thought, but they've lost the software program to run the machine of speech.
So their speech becomes slow, effortful, telegraphic, just single words: dog, run, street. It's incredibly frustrating for them because they are painfully aware of their deficit.
Wow. It really highlights that language isn't this one single thing. It's a beautifully orchestrated relay race.
And if any runner in that race drops the baton, the entire message fails to get across.
We're coming toward the end here, but we have to address the elephant in the room when we talk about memory. Pathology. When the system fails on a systemic level, specifically Alzheimer's disease.
It's the great thief of memory and of the self. And physiologically, it's defined by two hallmark pathological features: amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles.
The plaques are the sticky clumps that build up outside the neurons.
Right. They get in the way, interfere with synaptic signaling, and are thought to trigger inflammation.
And the tangles are inside the neurons.
This involves a protein called tau. Normally, tau protein acts like the railroad ties that stabilize the internal transport system of the neuron, the microtubules. In Alzheimer's, tau becomes hyperphosphorylated, it changes shape, and it clumps together into these tangles.
The railroad ties break.
The tracks fall apart. The neuron can't transport nutrients or other essential molecules up and down its axon. The cell essentially starves and disconnects from the network and eventually dies.
And this destructive process isn't random. It tends to hit the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex first.
The manufacturing plant. It shuts down first. And that is why the very first and most prominent symptom of Alzheimer's is a loss of recent episodic memory. Forgetting conversations you just had, what you ate for breakfast, where you parked the car.
But there is a small glimmer of hope in the text. The concept of neurogenesis.
Yes. The old dogma for 100 years was that you are born with all the neurons you will ever have, and that adults don't grow new ones. We now know that is false.
Where do we grow them?
We now know that at least two areas of the adult brain, the hippocampus and the olfactory bulb, continue to produce new neurons from resident stem cells throughout life.
And use it or lose it applies here with a vengeance.
It absolutely does. Ganong and other texts explicitly note that effortful mental activity, learning a new language, doing complex puzzles, learning a musical instrument stimulates this process. It builds what's called cognitive reserve.
So the idea is that you might have the underlying pathology, the plaques might be starting to form, but if you have spent your life building this massive, dense, redundant neural network, you can route around the damage for longer.
You can maintain function for much longer. It's like you're over-engineering your own brain to be more resilient to damage.
That is a very empowering thought. We aren't just passive victims of our biology. We are active participants in constructing it and maintaining it.
That is the core lesson of this entire field of physiology, I think.
So let's try to wrap this up. We've gone on an incredible journey from a single calcium ion entering a snail's neuron all the way up to the complex motor planning of a Shakespearean sonnet.
We've seen that learning isn't accumulation, it's physical reconstruction.
We've seen that memory is distributed throughout the cortex, not stored in one place. And that language is a synchronized dance between interpretation in the back of the brain and execution in the front.
A dance that defines so much of who we are.
Which brings me back to that thought we had right at the very beginning. If my brain structure physically changes every single time I learn something new,
then you are quite literally not the same person physically that you were when we started this conversation an hour ago.
we are all the ship of Theseus. We are constantly replacing the planks, rewiring the rigging, patching the sails, but we continue to sail under the same name.
A beautiful and, yeah, a slightly existential reality of being human.
On that note, thank you for diving deep with us. Keep those synapses firing, keep kicking out those magnesium ions, and we will see you next time.